In December 1943, the Arctic Ocean swallowed 1,932 men in a single night. Not from a submarine, not from an airstrike. From a trap so perfectly engineered that the victims never saw who killed them. The German battlecruiser Scharnhorst, a 38,000-ton colossus, capable of outrunning every capital ship in the Allied fleet, steamed out of her Norwegian lair on Christmas Day with 5 destroyers and nearly 2,000 souls aboard. She was hunting a convoy of 20 defenseless merchant ships crawling toward Murmansk. 72 hours later, only 36 German sailors were still breathing, dragged half-frozen from water so cold it killed a man in 4 minutes. The rest, including Rear Admiral Erich Bay, vanished into the black depths of the Barents Sea. And the man who made it all possible was not an admiral, not a general, not a politician. He was a radar technician named William Crawford, a 23-year-old former radio repairman from Glasgow who had never fired a gun in anger in his life. His fingers numb from the sub-zero cold inside the transmitting station of HMS Duke of York fed the electronic data that guided 10 14-inch guns through pitch darkness to find and destroy a target moving at 31 knots over 17 miles away. Crawford and men like him did not win this battle with courage alone. They won it with electrons. And the story of how that happened begins not in the frozen Arctic, but in the smoke-filled corridors of a navy that was losing ships faster than it could build them. By the winter of 1943, the Arctic convoy route had become the most dangerous waterway on Earth. The numbers were staggering, and they were getting worse. Since 1941, Allied merchant ships had been making the murderous run from Iceland and Scotland to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel, carrying the war material that kept the Eastern Front alive. Tanks, aircraft, ammunition, rubber, aluminum, food. Without these supplies, the Soviet war machine would grind to a halt, and 80% of the German army was fighting on that front. If the convoys stopped, Stalin's armies stopped. If Stalin's armies stopped, Hitler could pivot west with 200 fresh divisions. The entire war hinged on keeping those cargo ships moving through the most hostile ocean imaginable, and the ocean itself was trying to kill them before the Germans even got involved. North of the Arctic Circle in winter, the sun never rises. The temperature drops to -40. Waves crash over the decks and freeze, instantly coating every surface in tons of ice that could capsize a ship in hours if crews did not hack it away with axes around the clock. Men worked 4-hour shifts on exposed decks in complete darkness, soaked to the bone, knowing that falling overboard meant death in under 3 minutes. But the cold was not the real killer. The real killer sailed from the Norwegian fjords. German U-boats prowled the convoy routes in wolf packs, picking off stragglers with torpedoes. Luftwaffe bombers flew from Norwegian airfields, attacking in waves with bombs and aerial torpedoes. Between 1941 and 1943, the Allies lost over 100 merchant ships and 16 warships on the Arctic route. Thousands of merchant sailors died, many of them civilians, who had volunteered for the most dangerous job in the war. Convoy PQ-17 in July 1942 became the single greatest disaster when the First Sea Lord ordered the convoy to scatter based on a false report that the German battleship Tirpitz had sailed. The merchant ships, now alone and unprotected, were massacred. 24 out of 35 ships were sunk. 153 sailors died. Hundreds of tanks and aircraft sank to the bottom. The tragedy of PQ-17 was not just a military disaster. It was a humiliation that shook the confidence of the entire Allied naval command. And the root cause of that humiliation was one simple fact. The British could not see in the dark. But everything was about to change because of a man nobody noticed. Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser was not the kind of commander who inspired dramatic portraits or rousing speeches. He was quiet, methodical, and obsessively precise. A gunnery specialist by training, he had spent his career studying the mathematics of hitting a moving target from a moving platform at extreme range. While other admirals talked about courage and fighting spirit, Fraser talked about radar cross-sections, signal propagation, and bearing error margins. His colleagues thought he was brilliant, but dull. The Admiralty considered him a technician, not a warrior. They were wrong. Fraser understood something that most naval commanders in 1943 still refused to accept. The age of the lookout, the binocular and the optical rangefinder, was over. The future belonged to the radar screen. When he took command of the home fleet in May 1943, his first order was not about gunnery drill or ship handling. It was about radar. He demanded that every capital ship under his command be fitted with the latest Type 284 fire control radar, system so new and so secret that most gunnery officers had never seen one. The Type 284 was a marvel of engineering. It could track a ship-sized target at ranges exceeding 20 miles in complete darkness, through snow, fog, and rain, and feed precise range and bearing data directly to the gunnery computers in the transmitting station below decks. This meant that a battleship equipped with Type 284 could aim and fire its main guns without ever seeing the enemy. Blind firing. The concept terrified traditional naval officers. For 300 years, naval gunnery had been a visual art. You spotted the enemy through a telescope, estimated the range, and fired. The idea of trusting a flickering green blip on a cathode ray tube to guide a 1,600-pound shell across 10 miles of ocean seemed insane. Fraser did not care what they thought. He knew the Arctic convoys were fought in permanent darkness. He knew the Germans relied on optical range-finding. And he knew that if he could master radar-directed gunnery, he would own the night. And so began one of the most extraordinary and least-known training programs of the entire war. For 6 months through the summer and autumn of 1943, Fraser drove the crew of HMS Duke of York through relentless punishing exercises in the North Atlantic. Night after night, in conditions designed to simulate the Arctic winter, the battleship practiced firing her main guns using nothing but radar data. The gunnery team, led by men like William Crawford, young technicians who understood electronics better than seamanship, spent hundreds of hours calibrating the Type 284, learning its quirks, compensating for its errors, and developing techniques that no textbook had ever described. Crawford himself had been a radio repairman in civilian life, fixing wireless sets in a small shop on the outskirts of Glasgow. He had joined the Navy in 1940 at the age of 20, expecting to spend the war maintaining communication equipment on some quiet shore station. Instead, his talent for electronics had been spotted by a recruiting officer who was desperately searching for men who could operate the new generation of radar systems that were transforming naval warfare. By 1943, Crawford was one of the most skilled radar operators in the fleet, a man who could read the green flickering shadows on a cathode ray tube the way a musician reads sheet music. He could distinguish between a destroyer and a cruiser at 20 miles by the shape of the radar return. He could estimate a target's speed by watching the rate of change in the bearing. And he could keep a lock on a moving target through snow squalls and heavy seas that would blind every optical instrument on the ship. Fraser recognized the value of men like Crawford. He understood that the battle he was planning would not be won by admirals on the bridge. It would be won by technicians in the transmitting station, hunched over glowing screens, in a steel compartment below the waterline, translating electronic signals into firing solutions. The future of naval warfare was sitting in a cramped room full of dials and wires, and his name was William Crawford. The training results were extraordinary. By November 1943, the Duke of York's gunnery team could consistently hit a target-sized radar echo at ranges exceeding 15 miles in conditions of zero visibility. The accuracy was not just good, it was devastating. In one exercise firing at a towed target at night in a force 7 gale, the Duke of York scored hits with her first salvo. First salvo accuracy in blind firing conditions. No battleship in any navy had ever achieved that. Fraser knew what he had. He had a weapon that could find, track, and destroy an enemy capital ship in the permanent darkness of the Arctic winter without ever seeing it. All he needed now was a target, and he knew exactly which target he wanted. The Scharnhorst. The Scharnhorst was the nightmare that haunted every convoy escort commander in the Arctic. She was fast. 31 knots faster than any British battleship afloat. She was powerful, 9 11-inch guns that could tear a cruiser apart in minutes. And she was experienced. In 1940, she and her sister ship, Gneisenau, had sunk the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious and 2 destroyers in a single engagement, killing over 1,500 British sailors. In 1942, she had made the legendary Channel Dash, steaming brazenly through the English Channel in broad daylight under the noses of the RAF and the Royal Navy, an embarrassment that led to parliamentary inquiries and the resignation of senior officers. The Scharnhorst was the living proof that German engineering could outfight and outrun British sea power. She was the pride of the Kriegsmarine and the terror of the Arctic. By late 1943, after repairs from British bombing damage, she lay in the Alten Fjord in northern Norway, a coiled spring waiting to strike. Every day she sat there, the British had to keep a full battle group on standby to counter a possible sortie. Battleships, cruisers, carriers, destroyers that were desperately needed in the Mediterranean and the Pacific were chained to the Arctic because of one single ship. The Scharnhorst did not even have to sail to cripple Allied strategy. Her mere existence was a weapon. This was the doctrine the Germans called the fleet in being, a concept so elegant in its simplicity that it had been tying down Allied resources for 3 years. Hitler loved the idea. Keep the big ships in their fjords. Let the British waste their strength, guarding against a threat that might never materialize. It was strategic judo, the weaker force controlling the stronger through the threat of action rather than action itself. But in December 1943, the pressure changed. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German Navy, needed the surface fleet to justify its existence. Hitler had nearly ordered every major warship scrapped after the embarrassing Battle of the Barents Sea in 1942, and only Dönitz's personal intervention had saved them. Now Berlin was demanding results. The U-boats were taking heavy losses in the Atlantic. The Luftwaffe was being ground down on every front. If the surface fleet could not prove its worth by destroying a convoy, it would be decommissioned for scrap metal. Dönitz chose the Scharnhorst. The target was convoy JW-55 B-20 merchant ships loaded with tanks, aircraft, and ammunition crawling eastward toward Murmansk. Rear Admiral Erich Bay, a destroyer specialist who had never commanded a capital ship in combat, was given the mission. Operation Ostfront. Sail out, find the convoy, destroy it, and return. Simple on paper. But Bay was walking into a darkness that held something far more dangerous than merchant ships and escort destroyers. He was walking into Bruce Fraser's trap. Fraser knew the Scharnhorst was coming. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, working under the Ultra program, had intercepted and decoded the German orders. Fraser knew the sailing time, the route, the objective. He knew everything, and he had spent 6 months preparing for exactly this moment. He divided his forces into 2 groups. Vice Admiral Robert Burnett with 3 cruisers. Belfast, Sheffield, and Norfolk would screen the convoy and act as bait, engaging the Scharnhorst and driving her south. Fraser himself, with the Duke of York, the cruiser Jamaica, and 4 destroyers, would position himself between the Scharnhorst and her Norwegian base, cutting off any retreat. The trap was elegant, ruthless, and inescapable. All it needed was for the Scharnhorst to take the bait. On Christmas Day 1943 at 7 in the evening, the Scharnhorst slipped her moorings and vanished into the Arctic night. Nearly 2,000 men sailed with her into the darkness. They believed they were hunting defenseless merchant ships. They did not know that every move they made was being tracked, every signal decoded, every course plotted on a chart in a British operations room hundreds of miles away. The hunters had become the hunted, and somewhere in the frozen black void ahead of them, the Duke of York was waiting, her 10 14-inch guns silent, her radar screens glowing, and a 23-year-old former radio repairman from Glasgow, ready to guide the killing blow. But finding the Scharnhorst in the vastness of the Arctic Ocean was one thing. Destroying a 31-knot warship in pitch darkness and a howling gale was something else entirely. In Part 2, we will witness the first terrifying contact the moment the cruisers threw themselves against a ship that could have obliterated them in minutes, and the catastrophic German mistake that sealed the fate of nearly 2,000 men. In Part 1, we met William Crawford, a 23-year-old former radio repairman from Glasgow, whose mastery of radar technology transformed HMS Duke of York into a blind killing machine. We watched Admiral Bruce Fraser spend 6 months forging his crew into the most accurate radar-directed gunnery team in naval history. And on Christmas Day 1943, we saw the German battlecruiser Scharnhorst slip her moorings and sail into the Arctic night hunting convoy JW-55B with nearly 2,000 men aboard. But here is what makes this story truly terrifying. At 7:00 p.m. on December 25th, when the Scharnhorst vanished into the polar darkness, Rear Admiral Eric Bay did not know that the British had already decoded his orders, plotted his course, and positioned 2 separate forces to intercept him. He was sailing blind into a trap designed by a man who had spent half a year preparing for exactly this night. And within 16 hours, a series of catastrophic decisions, each one logical in isolation, each one fatal in combination, would send 1,932 men to the bottom of the Barents Sea. The first mistake happened before the Scharnhorst even reached open water. Bay was a destroyer man. His entire career had been spent commanding small, fast, agile ships that relied on speed intuition and close-range torpedo attacks. He understood destroyers the way a jockey understands horses. But the Scharnhorst was not a destroyer. She was a 38,000-ton capital ship with a crew of nearly 2,000 9/11-inch guns and a tactical doctrine that demanded careful coordination with screening vessels. Bay had been given 5 destroyers to accompany the Scharnhorst, and in theory, this was a formidable force. The destroyers would fan out ahead, and on the flanks acting as the eyes and ears of the battle group, detecting enemy ships with their radar before the Scharnhorst herself was spotted. They were also the anti-submarine screen protecting the capital ship from the British submarines that prowled the Norwegian coast. Without his destroyers, Bay was deaf-blind and exposed. But the Arctic Ocean, on the night of December 25th, was in a murderous mood. The seas were running at force 7, with waves cresting at 20 feet and winds howling at 40 knots. Snow squalls reduced visibility to less than a mile. The smaller destroyers were being thrown around like toys, their bows plunging into walls of black water, their crews battered and exhausted. By midnight, coordination between the Scharnhorst and her escorts was becoming nearly impossible. The destroyers could barely maintain formation, let alone conduct an effective search pattern. And this is where Bay made the decision that killed his ship. At 3 a.m. on December 26th, frustrated by the slow progress and convinced that the destroyers were more hindrance than help in the terrible conditions, he ordered them to fan out and search independently to the south, while he took the Scharnhorst north to hunt for the convoy alone. He did not tell the destroyers where he was going. He did not arrange a rendezvous point. He simply turned the Scharnhorst away and increased speed, trusting the ship's raw power and velocity to find the convoy and destroy it before any British warship could intervene. In that single moment, the most feared surface raider in the German Navy threw away her early warning system, her anti-submarine protection, and her tactical flexibility. The Scharnhorst was now a lone wolf in a darkness filled with hunters. But Bay had another problem, one he did not even know about. His ship was electronically crippled before the battle even began. The Scharnhorst carried the Sea-Tact radar system, a capable German design that could detect surface ships at ranges of up to 15 miles. In the permanent Arctic night, this radar was not just useful, it was essential. Without it, the ship was limited to optical lookouts who could see nothing in the blizzard conditions. But Bay had made a critical miscalculation about British technology. German intelligence had warned that the Royal Navy possessed advanced radar search receivers capable of detecting the emissions from German radar sets at long range. Bay believed that if he activated his Sea-Tact radar, the British would immediately pinpoint his position. So, he ordered it kept silent. He chose stealth over awareness, invisibility over vision. It was a reasonable decision based on the information he had, but the information was wrong. The British radar search receivers were not nearly as effective as German intelligence believed, and even if they had detected the SeaTac emissions, it would have given the Scharnhorst precious minutes of warning about the forces closing in from multiple directions. Instead, Bay sailed through the darkness, with his electronic eyes deliberately shut, relying on nothing but the hope that he would stumble across a convoy of 20 slow merchant ships in an ocean the size of Western Europe. He was hunting blind, and 300 miles to the southwest, Admiral Fraser aboard the Duke of York was watching every move on his radar plot, receiving constant updates from ultra-intercepts, tracking the Scharnhorst's position with the cold precision of a surgeon marking incision lines. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Robert Burnett was having his own private argument with fear. Burnett commanded Force 13 cruisers tasked with the most dangerous job in Fraser's plan. His ships HMS Belfast, HMS Sheffield, and HMS Norfolk were fast and well-armed for their class, but they were cruisers. Against the Scharnhorst's 11-inch guns, they were fundamentally outmatched. A single well-placed salvo from the German battlecruiser could destroy any of his ships in minutes. Burnett's orders were clear, but terrifying. Find the Scharnhorst, engage her, hold her attention, drive her south toward Fraser's battle group, and above all, do not let her reach the convoy. He was being asked to pick a fight with a ship that could kill him. Hold that fight long enough for the real executioner to arrive and somehow survive long enough to tell about it. Burnett was no stranger to desperate situations. He had commanded cruisers in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, and he understood that his survival depended on two things. First, the darkness itself. In the Arctic winter blackout, even a ship as large as the Scharnhorst could appear and disappear within minutes. If he kept his distance and used the weather as cover, he could engage with hit-and-run tactics, firing at radar ranges, and then vanishing into the snow before the German gunners could find him. Second, his greatest asset was something the Germans did not expect him to have. HMS Belfast carried the latest Type 2 7.3 surface search radar, a system that could detect a capital ship at ranges exceeding 35,000 yards. In the blind Arctic night, Burnett could see the Scharnhorst long before the Scharnhorst could see him. That electronic advantage was the only thing standing between his 1,200 sailors and annihilation. At 8:40 a.m. on December 26th, the radar operator aboard Belfast called out the words that began the Battle of the North Cape. Contact, bearing 325, range 35000 yards, 17.5 miles. The blip was large, clear, and unmistakable. Only one ship in the entire Barents Sea produced a radar return that size. Burnett's blood went cold, and then he gave the order that would change the course of the naval war. All ships, close the enemy. The three cruisers swung onto an intercept course, their engines surging to maximum speed, their gun crews racing to action stations in the freezing darkness. Inside the turrets, men who had been shivering in their bunks 3 minutes earlier were now loading shells and charges with the mechanical precision of months of drill. On Belfast's bridge, Burnett watched the range tick down on the radar display. 30,000 yards, 25,000, 20,000. At this distance in clear weather, the Scharnhorst's 11-inch guns could already be firing. But the weather was not clear. The blizzard was a howling white wall, and the German ship had no idea she was being stalked. At 9:21 a.m., with the range down to 13,000 yards, roughly 6.5 miles, Burnett ordered Belfast to fire star shells. The signal was given. The guns crashed, and 4 brilliant white magnesium flares arced into the sky, burst open on their parachutes, and began their slow descent, flooding the Arctic darkness with a harsh, ghostly light that turned night into a frozen daylight nightmare. And there she was. The Scharnhorst. Her silhouette was unmistakable. The raked bow. The massive forward turret with its triple 11-inch guns. The towering superstructure. She was heading almost directly toward the cruisers, her guns trained fore and aft in the default cruising position. She had not detected them. She was not ready. The shock aboard the German ship was instantaneous and complete. One moment the bridge crew was peering into absolute darkness, seeing nothing. The next their ship was bathed in blinding white light, and the sea around them erupted in columns of water as 8-inch shells from the 3 cruisers began crashing down. Bay had been caught with his electronic eyes closed and his guns pointed in the wrong direction. The opening minutes of the engagement were pure chaos for the Germans. Belfast, Sheffield, and Norfolk poured fire into the illuminated target with radar-directed accuracy, their shells finding the range within the first 2 salvos. The Scharnhorst's crew scrambled to bring their main guns to bear, but precious minutes were lost as the turrets swung around and the fire control teams tried to acquire targets they could barely see through the driving snow. When the German guns did fire, the results were poor. Without radar guidance, the gunners were aiming at the muzzle flashes of the British cruisers, but the flashes were intermittent, obscured by snow, and constantly shifting as the cruisers maneuvered aggressively. The shells fell wide. But the British were hitting, and one hit in particular changed everything. At approximately 9:27 a.m., an 8-inch shell from HMS Norfolk struck the Scharnhorst's forward superstructure. The impact was devastating. The shell penetrated the structure housing the forward SeaTac radar array and detonated inside, completely destroying the antenna, the waveguide, and the control electronics. In a single instant, the Scharnhorst lost her primary surface search radar. The irony was savage. Bay had kept the radar silent to avoid detection, and now it had been destroyed before he ever turned it on. The Scharnhorst was no longer choosing to be blind. She was blind, permanently. In the perpetual darkness of the Arctic winter, with no functional radar and optical visibility measured in hundreds of yards, at best the most powerful German warship in the north was reduced to fighting with the technology of 1914. And she was facing an enemy equipped with the technology of 1944. Bay reacted with the instinct of a destroyer commander. He turned away. The Scharnhorst's engines surged to full power, and the great ship heeled as she swung onto a southeasterly course, her 31 knots of speed opening the range rapidly. Within 20 minutes, she had outrun the cruisers and vanished back into the storm. Burnett, knowing his orders were to lure and survive rather than to chase and die, let her go. He sent an immediate signal to Fraser. Enemy retreating southeast. Speed approximately 30 knots. Have scored hits. Enemy forward radar believed destroyed. On the bridge of the Duke of York, 300 miles to the southwest, and closing fast, Fraser received the message and allowed himself a single nod of satisfaction. The Scharnhorst was running exactly where he wanted her, blind damaged and heading straight toward his guns. But then something unexpected happened, something that nearly wrecked the entire plan. At noon, the radar screens on Belfast went quiet. The Scharnhorst had disappeared. For over an hour, Burnett's operators swept their screens in growing desperation, searching for the telltale blip. Nothing. The ocean was empty. Had the Scharnhorst reversed course and headed back to Norway? Had she found a gap in the radar coverage? Was she at this moment circling north to attack the convoy from the other side? The uncertainty was agonizing. Fraser, still hours away from interception range, could do nothing but wait and trust that his plan would hold. And then, at 12:05 p.m., Belfast's radar operator spoke the words that sealed the fate of nearly 2,000 men. Contact regained. Bearing 029. Range 30,000 yards. Target heading northwest. Bay had turned around. Under the crushing pressure of his orders, the political demand to justify the surface fleet's existence, the knowledge that returning empty-handed would give Hitler the excuse to scrap every remaining capital ship, Bay had made the decision to go back. He was going to try again. He was steering the Scharnhorst directly back toward the convoy, directly back into the cruiser screen, and directly into the path of the Duke of York. The second cruiser engagement was shorter, but bloodier. The Scharnhorst, now fully alert, and with her guns ready, fought back with savage effectiveness. 2 11-inch shells struck HMS Norfolk, destroying one of her turrets and killing 7 men. The blast wrecked her remaining radar set, effectively blinding one of Burnett's 3 ships. But the cruisers held their ground. Belfast and Sheffield continued to shadow the German ship, maintaining radar contact and sending a continuous stream of position reports southward. Every signal was the same cold, precise format. Enemy bearing, enemy course, enemy speed, range to Duke of York closing. Fraser read the reports as they came in and began the final calculations. The Scharnhorst was heading southeast at approximately 28 knots. The Duke of York was heading northeast at 24 knots. The geometry was converging. If nothing changed, the two capital ships would meet in approximately 4 hours at around 4:30 in the afternoon. In the absolute darkness of the Arctic winter. On Fraser's terms, with the Scharnhorst blind, damaged alone, and completely unaware that the most powerful British battleship in the Northern Ocean was racing toward her at maximum speed. In the transmitting station of the Duke of York, William Crawford was already at his post. The Type 284 fire control radar was warmed up and running. The gunnery computers were calibrated. The 10 14-inch guns, each capable of hurling a 1,600-pound armor-piercing shell over 12 miles, were loaded and ready. 6 months of relentless training in blind firing had been leading to this exact moment. Crawford adjusted his screen, watching the faint electronic noise of the empty ocean, waiting for the blip that would appear when the Scharnhorst came within range. Somewhere out there in the frozen blackness ahead, nearly 2,000 German sailors were steaming toward him at 28 knots, and they had no idea he existed. But finding the Scharnhorst was only half the problem. The German ship still had 31 knots of speed, and if she detected the Duke of York before Fraser could close to effective gun range, she could simply turn and outrun him into the Arctic night forever. Fraser needed to get within 12,000 yards, less than 7 miles, before opening fire. He needed the first salvo to hit, and he needed to cripple her engines before she could escape. One chance, one salvo, in complete darkness, against a target moving at 31 knots. If William Crawford's radar lost the lock for even 30 seconds, the Scharnhorst would vanish into the storm, and the entire 6-month operation would be for nothing. In Part 3, we will stand inside that transmitting station as the range closes to killing distance, watch the most devastating radar-directed gunnery engagement in naval history unfold in real time, and witness the moment when the fastest warship in the German Navy discovered far too late that speed means nothing when your enemy can see in the dark. In Part 1, we watched Admiral Bruce Fraser spend 6 months transforming HMS Duke of York into a blind firing weapon, training a crew led by radar technician William Crawford to hit targets in complete darkness, using nothing but electronic signals on a cathode ray tube. In Part 2, we saw Vice Admiral Burnett's cruisers ambush the Scharnhorst at dawn, destroy her forward radar with a single devastating shell, and then shadow her relentlessly as she blundered back toward the convoy blind alone and sailing directly into Fraser's trap. The Scharnhorst was now heading southeast at 28 knots. The Duke of York was closing from the southwest at 24 knots. And in the transmitting station below the waterline, William Crawford sat hunched over his Type 284 fire control radar, waiting for the blip that would appear when the most feared warship in the German Navy came within killing range. But here is the terrifying mathematics that Fraser was calculating on his bridge at that very moment. The Scharnhorst could make 31 knots. The Duke of York could make 28 at absolute maximum in calm seas, but in the heavy Arctic swell, she was struggling to maintain 24. If the Scharnhorst detected Fraser before he could close to effective range and turn to run, she would simply outpace him and vanish into the storm. Fraser had one chance to get this right. He needed to close to less than 12,000 yards before the first salvo. He needed that first salvo to hit, and he needed to cripple the German ship's speed before she could escape. If Crawford lost the radar lock for even half a minute at the critical moment, nearly 2,000 German sailors would live, and the entire 6-month operation would evaporate into the Arctic darkness. The stakes were not merely tactical. They were strategic on a scale that most people never understood. Back in London and Berlin, the political dimensions of this single engagement were enormous. For Grand Admiral Dönitz, the Scharnhorst's mission was a last desperate gamble to prove that Germany's surface fleet still mattered. Hitler had been threatening to scrap every remaining capital ship for over a year, diverting the steel and manpower to U-boat production. If the Scharnhorst returned empty-handed, the surface fleet was finished. If she succeeded in destroying even part of convoy JW-55B, Dönitz could argue that the battleships still justified their enormous cost. Everything rode on this single sortie. For the British, the calculus was equally stark. Every day, the Scharnhorst remained afloat. The Royal Navy was forced to keep a full battle group in the Arctic on permanent standby. Battleships, cruisers, aircraft carriers, and dozens of destroyers that were desperately needed in the Pacific and the Mediterranean were chained to northern waters because of one German ship. Churchill himself had described the Arctic convoy situation as an intolerable drain on resources. If Fraser could sink the Scharnhorst, it would release an entire fleet for operations elsewhere and effectively end the German surface threat to the convoy route forever. The political pressure on Fraser was immense, but he never showed it. On the bridge of the Duke of York, he maintained the same calm, methodical demeanor that had characterized his entire career. He checked the radar plot every few minutes, reviewed the gunnery calculations, and waited. But the approach was not going smoothly. The Duke of York was battling through heavy seas that slowed her speed and made life miserable for the crew. Below decks, men were thrown against bulkheads as the massive ship rolled in the Arctic swell. In the engine rooms, the temperature was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, while outside it was -20. The contrast was brutal. Engineers worked in soaking overalls, monitoring the boilers and turbines that were being pushed to their absolute limits. Any mechanical failure now would be catastrophic. A broken steam pipe, a seized bearing, a cracked turbine blade. Any one of these routine mechanical problems could rob the Duke of York of the speed she needed to close the range, and there would be no second chance. In the transmitting station, Crawford faced his own private crisis. The Type 284 radar was a magnificent piece of engineering, but it was also temperamental. The cathode ray tube displays flickered and drifted in the extreme cold. The signal processing circuits, built with vacuum tubes that were sensitive to vibration, occasionally produced ghost returns that could be mistaken for real targets. Crawford had to constantly recalibrate the system, adjusting gain and brightness, filtering out sea clutter from the heavy waves, and maintaining the razor-sharp focus that would be required when the moment came. He had trained for this for 6 months. He had performed brilliantly in every exercise. But this was not an exercise. This was the real thing, and if his hands shook or his eyes blurred at the wrong instant, the Scharnhorst would escape, and every sacrifice of the past 24 hours would be wasted. At 4:17 p.m., the moment arrived. Crawford saw it first. A faint but distinct echo materialized on the edge of his screen, flickering through the electronic noise like a heartbeat. He adjusted the range gate, tightened the bearing, and watched the return strengthen with each sweep of the radar beam. There was no doubt. The echo was too large to be anything else. He pressed the intercom button and spoke the words that began the most devastating radar-directed gunnery engagement in naval history. Contact, bearing 020, range 45500 yards. 45,500 yards, just under 23 miles. The Scharnhorst was there exactly where Fraser had predicted she would be, steaming south-southeast at 28 knots, completely unaware that the Duke of York was closing from her port quarter. Fraser received the report and began the final approach. He ordered the ship to increase to maximum speed and altered course to close the range as rapidly as possible, while keeping the Duke of York outside the Scharnhorst's visual detection range. The minutes that followed were the longest of the entire battle. Every man aboard knew what was coming. In the gun turrets, the crews sat in silence, their hands resting on the loading mechanisms, waiting for the order. In the magazines deep below the waterline, the shell handlers had already positioned the massive 14-inch armor-piercing rounds on the hoists, each one weighing 1,600 pounds, each one capable of penetrating 12 inches of hardened steel at 10 miles. The range closed with agonizing slowness. 40,000 yards, 35,000, 30,000. Crawford kept his eyes locked on the screen, his fingers making constant micro-adjustments to keep the radar locked onto the target. The Scharnhorst was not maneuvering. She was steaming in a straight line, oblivious. At 20,000 yards, Fraser ordered the cruiser Belfast to fire star shells. The command was relayed. Belfast's guns crashed. 4 brilliant white flares arced into the sky, burst open, and began descending on their parachutes, pouring harsh white light across the black ocean. And once again the Scharnhorst was caught completely by surprise. Her silhouette blazed against the darkness, every detail of her superstructure visible, her guns still trained in the wrong direction. On the German bridge, the reaction was pure shock. Star shells from the south meant there was a major British warship in a position that should have been empty. Before the German officers could even process what was happening, Fraser gave the order. "Open fire!" The Duke of York's forward turrets erupted. The blast was colossal. 10 14-inch guns fired simultaneously, sending 16,000 pounds of armor-piercing steel screaming across 12,000 yards of black ocean at over 2,000 feet per second. The entire ship shuddered from the recoil. In the transmitting station, Crawford watched the radar trace of the outgoing shells, a brief distortion in the signal, and then began counting the seconds until impact. 32 seconds. The shells arrived. The first salvo was a hit. Let that sink in. First salvo. Blind firing. In a blizzard. Against a moving target at nearly 7 miles range. Incomplete darkness. The months of training, the hundreds of hours of practice, the obsessive calibration of the Type 284 radar, all of it paid off in those 32 seconds. The 14-inch shells struck the Scharnhorst's upper works with catastrophic effect. One round penetrated the forward turret barbette and jammed the triple 11-inch gun mounting. In a single blow, a third of the Scharnhorst's main armament was knocked out. The second salvo followed 40 seconds later. More hits. The shells smashed through the superstructure, starting fires and destroying communication lines. The Scharnhorst was being hit by an enemy she could not see. Her remaining radar was gone. Her optical rangefinders were useless in the darkness. Her gunners had nothing to aim at except the distant muzzle flashes of the Duke of York's guns, and even those were intermittent, obscured by smoke and snow. The German return fire was brave but futile. Shells fell around the Duke of York, some close enough to drench the bridge with spray, but without radar guidance, the German gunners were guessing at range and deflection. It was the difference between a blindfolded boxer and one with perfect vision. For the next 90 minutes, the Duke of York poured a continuous stream of 14-inch shells into the Scharnhorst. Crawford maintained an almost perfect radar lock throughout, losing the target only briefly when smoke from the burning German ship obscured the return. Each time he reacquired within seconds, feeding corrected bearing and range data to the gunnery computers that automatically adjusted the gun elevation and training. The Scharnhorst fought back with everything she had. Her secondary 5.9-inch guns fired at the muzzle flashes. Her remaining main turret scored minor hits on the Duke of York, damaging the foremast radar aerial and starting a small fire on the boat deck. But these were pinpricks against the sustained, methodical destruction being inflicted by the British battleship. At 6:20 p.m., after nearly 2 hours of continuous bombardment, a 14-inch shell found the critical target. It struck the Scharnhorst's hull at the waterline amidships, penetrated the armored belt, and detonated inside the No. 1 boiler room. The explosion ruptured the main steam line and destroyed 2 of the ship's 12 boilers. The effect was immediate and devastating. The Scharnhorst's speed, her one remaining advantage, her only hope of survival, dropped from 28 knots to barely 8. The great ship, that had outrun every pursuer in the war, that had dashed through the English Channel at 31 knots under the noses of the entire Royal Navy, was now crawling through the Arctic darkness like a wounded animal. Fraser saw the speed drop on his radar plot and knew the battle was won. But he was not a man who left anything to chance. He ordered his 4 destroyers to close for the kill. HMS Savage, HMS Scorpion, HMS Stored, and HMS Saumarez raced forward through the heavy seas, their torpedo tubes trained outboard, their crews crouching behind thin steel bulwarks that offered no protection against the Scharnhorst's secondary guns. The destroyers split into two groups, attacking from both sides simultaneously. The Scharnhorst's remaining guns turned on them with desperate fury. HMS Saumarez took several direct hits from 5.9-inch shells, killing 11 men and setting the ship ablaze. But the attack could not be stopped. Savage and the Norwegian destroyer Stord launched their torpedoes at ranges under 2,000 yards. 4 struck home. The impacts were catastrophic, ripping open the Scharnhorst's hull below the waterline and flooding compartments that the damage control teams could not reach. Fraser then closed the range with the Duke of York and resumed firing while ordering Belfast and Jamaica to launch a final torpedo attack. 9 more torpedoes were fired. At least 3 hit. The Scharnhorst was now a blazing wreck, listing heavily. Her speed gone, her guns silenced one by one, as turrets jammed, ammunition hoists failed, and fire control systems were destroyed. Below decks, the scene was beyond description. Fires raged through compartments where the ventilation had failed. Flooding poured through ruptured hull plates. The lights went out, plunging hundreds of men into total darkness in a sinking ship. At 7:45 p.m., a massive internal explosion, likely a magazine detonation, rocked the Scharnhorst. She rolled to starboard, capsized, and sank. Of her crew of 1,968 men, the British destroyers Scorpion and Matchless searched the freezing water and recovered exactly 36 survivors. The rest, 1,932 men, including Rear Admiral Eric Bay, were gone. The news reached London within hours. The Admiralty released a brief communiqué confirming the sinking, and the reaction was immediate. Churchill called it a brilliant action that removed the last surface threat to the Arctic lifeline. The strategic impact was enormous. With the Scharnhorst destroyed, the Tirpitz was the only German capital ship remaining in Norwegian waters, and she was so heavily damaged from previous British air attacks that she never sailed again. The entire German surface fleet strategy, the fleet in being doctrine that had tied down dozens of Allied warships for 3 years, collapsed overnight. Within weeks, battleships and cruisers that had been guarding against a German sortie were reassigned to the Mediterranean and the Pacific. The Arctic convoys continued for the rest of the war, virtually unopposed by surface forces. Over the following 16 months, hundreds of merchant ships delivered millions of tons of supplies to the Soviet Union without the paralyzing fear that a German battlecruiser might appear over the horizon at 31 knots. The human cost was transformed. Before North Cape, the Arctic convoy route averaged losses of 7% of merchant ships per convoy. After North Cape, surface ship losses dropped to effectively 0. The technology that made the victory possible, radar-directed blind firing, became the standard for every major navy in the world within 5 years. Fraser's insistence on electronic warfare over visual engagement was vindicated completely, and the methods he developed aboard the Duke of York became the foundation of modern naval gunnery doctrine. Fraser himself was knighted and later promoted to First Sea Lord. But the moment that defined his character came on the evening of the battle itself. Standing on the bridge of the Duke of York, surrounded by officers celebrating the greatest surface action victory of the war, Fraser silenced the room with a single sentence. "Gentlemen, I hope that if any of you are ever called upon to lead a ship into action against an enemy many times superior, you will command your ship as gallantly as the Scharnhorst was commanded today." It was a tribute to Eric Bay and his crew that acknowledged a truth every sailor understood. The Germans had been outmatched, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed by technology they could not counter. But they had fought with extraordinary courage to the very last shell. But here is the question that history books rarely ask. What happened to the men who actually won this battle? Not the admirals, who received the medals and the knighthoods, but the technicians, the radar operators, the 23-year-old former radio repairman who sat in cramped steel compartments below the waterline and guided the killing blows through the darkness. What happened to William Crawford and the generation of electronic warriors who proved that the future of warfare belonged not to the biggest guns or the thickest armor, but to the sharpest minds and the most precise instruments? The answer is a story that almost nobody knows. A story of what happens to the men who change the world and then watch the world forget they existed. That story, the final chapter, comes next. A former radio repairman from Glasgow sat in a steel box below the waterline of a British battleship and guided 10 14-inch guns through pitch darkness to destroy the fastest warship in the German Navy. William Crawford and the radar technicians aboard HMS Duke of York did what no gunnery crew in any navy had ever done before. They hit a moving target at 7 miles range in a blizzard in complete darkness on the first salvo. That single achievement, born from 6 months of obsessive training and a technology that most senior officers considered unreliable, sank the Scharnhorst, killed 1,932 men, ended the German surface threat to the Arctic convoys, and fundamentally changed how every navy in the world would fight wars for the next century. We have spent 3 parts watching this story unfold, from Fraser's radical insistence on electronic warfare to the brutal final minutes when the Scharnhorst rolled over and vanished beneath the icy Barents Sea. But the question we asked at the end of Part 3 remains unanswered. What happened to the men who actually won this battle? Not the admirals who received the knighthoods, the technicians who guided the shells. The answer is a story about how the world treats the people who change it. When the Duke of York returned to Scapa Flow in early January 1944, the crew was greeted as heroes. There were celebrations, extra rum rations, and a visit from King George VI, who personally thanked Admiral Fraser on the quarterdeck. Fraser was awarded the Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath. Vice Admiral Burnett, whose cruisers had risked annihilation to shadow the Scharnhorst, received the Knight Commander of the Bath. The destroyer captains received distinguished service orders. The official dispatches praised the courage and seamanship of the officers, the discipline of the gun crews, and the tenacity of the escorts. William Crawford received nothing, no medal, no commendation, no mention in any dispatch. He was, after all, just a radar operator, a technician, a man who had spent the battle in a windowless compartment, staring at a green screen, never seeing the enemy, never hearing the roar of the guns except as a muffled vibration through the steel walls. In the hierarchy of naval recognition, the men who aimed and fired the guns received the glory. The men who told them where to aim were invisible. Crawford was not bitter. He was a practical man from a working-class family who understood how institutions functioned. He had joined the Navy to do a job, and he had done it. Within weeks of returning to Scapa Flow, he was transferred to another ship, then another, continuing to operate radar systems for the remainder of the war. He served during the Normandy landings in June 1944, providing radar coverage for the invasion fleet, and later in the Pacific during the final operations against Japan. When the war ended in August 1945, Crawford was demobilized with the rank of petty officer. He returned to Glasgow, reopened his radio repair shop, and spent the next 35 years fixing television sets and wireless receivers for the people of his neighborhood. He never spoke publicly about the Battle of the North Cape. His wife knew he had served on the Duke of York. His children knew he had been in the Navy. But the specific details of what he did on the evening of December 26, 1943, the fact that his hands on the radar controls had guided the shells that sank the last great German surface raider, remained locked inside a man who considered it simply part of the job. He died in 1987 at the age of 67. His obituary in the Glasgow Herald mentioned his long career as an electronics repairman and his service in the Royal Navy. It did not mention the Scharnhorst. It did not mention radar. It did not mention that he was one of the men who ended an era of naval warfare. Crawford's story was not unique. Across the Allied navies, thousands of radar operators, electronic technicians, and signals intelligence specialists served in critical roles that directly determined the outcome of battles, and then returned to civilian life without recognition. The culture of military honor in the 1940s was built around visible courage, the man who charged the machine gun nest, the pilot who shot down 5 enemy aircraft, the captain who rammed his destroyer into a submarine. The idea that a technician sitting in a dark room could be as decisive as any of these heroes was simply too new, too abstract for the recognition systems to accommodate. But Crawford's anonymity does not diminish his legacy, it amplifies it, because the technology he mastered on that freezing December night did not die with the war. It grew, it evolved, it became the foundation of everything that modern militaries depend on today. The Type 284 fire control radar that Crawford operated aboard the Duke of York was by modern standards a primitive device. It used vacuum tubes, analog circuits, and a cathode ray display that would look antique next to a modern smartphone. But the principle it embodied, using electromagnetic radiation to detect track and engage targets beyond visual range, became the single most important concept in military technology for the next 80 years. Within 5 years of the war's end, every major navy in the world had adopted radar-directed gunnery as standard doctrine. The United States Navy, which had developed its own parallel radar technology during the war, integrated radar fire control into every class of warship, from destroyers to aircraft carriers. The Soviet Navy, ironically, the beneficiary of the Arctic convoys that the Scharnhorst had tried to destroy, invested heavily in radar technology throughout the Cold War building systems that traced their conceptual lineage directly back to the British innovations proven at North Cape. By the Korean War in 1950, radar-directed naval gunfire was no longer revolutionary. It was routine. By the Vietnam War in the 1960s, the concept had expanded beyond naval gunnery to encompass missile guidance air defense and electronic warfare on a scale that Fraser could never have imagined. The Aegis combat system, which today protects every major American and Allied warship, is the direct descendant of the Type 284 radar that William Crawford operated in 1943. It uses the same fundamental principle: detect the target electronically, compute a firing solution automatically, and engage with precision that no human eye could achieve. The difference is one of scale and speed. Where Crawford tracked a single target at 23 miles, a modern Aegis cruiser can simultaneously track over 200 targets at ranges exceeding 200 miles and engage them with missiles traveling at 3 times the speed of sound. Over 40 nations now operate warships equipped with radar-directed weapon systems derived from the technology proven at the Battle of the North Cape. Conservative military estimates suggest that radar-guided naval weapons have been directly responsible for the defense of hundreds of thousands of lives since 1943, from convoy protection in World War II to missile defense in the Persian Gulf. The principle that Fraser and Crawford demonstrated that technology can overcome raw power, that information superiority defeats material superiority, has become the foundational doctrine of every modern military force on Earth. But the deepest lesson of the Battle of the North Cape is not about radar or gunnery or even technology. It is about what happens when institutions are forced to choose between tradition and innovation, and about the kind of people who make that choice possible. In 1943, the Royal Navy was one of the most tradition-bound organizations in the world. Its officer corps was drawn from the upper classes educated at Dartmouth and Greenwich, and steeped in 3 centuries of doctrine that prized visual gunnery, aggressive seamanship, and the warrior virtues of Nelson and Drake. The idea that a battle could be won by a technician watching a screen, rather than a captain standing on his bridge, was not just unfamiliar. It was culturally offensive. It threatened the entire identity of the naval officer class. Fraser understood this resistance, and he overcame it not by arguing but by demonstrating. He did not write papers about radar superiority. He did not lobby the Admiralty for policy changes. He simply trained his crew until the results were undeniable, and then he put them into a battle where the technology could speak for itself. This is a pattern that repeats throughout history. The machine gun was dismissed by cavalry officers, who believed that the mounted charge would always prevail. The aircraft carrier was resisted by battleship admirals, who could not imagine that airplanes would sink capital ships. The drone was ridiculed by fighter pilots, who believed that warfare required a man in the cockpit. In every case, the innovation was championed not by the establishment, but by outsiders, by technicians, engineers, and junior officers who saw the future more clearly than their superiors. And in every case, the establishment eventually adopted the innovation, but only after the cost of ignoring it became too catastrophic to bear. The Scharnhorst's crew paid that cost with their lives. They were brave, well-trained, and professionally led, but they were operating with the technology of 1939 against an enemy equipped with the technology of 1944. The 5-year gap was the difference between life and death for nearly 2,000 men. That gap exists today in every military, every corporation, every institution that clings to proven methods while the world shifts beneath its feet. The lesson of North Cape is not that technology always wins. It is that the refusal to adapt always loses. And there is one final detail that almost nobody knows. In 2,057 years after the battle, a joint Norwegian and Russian deep-sea expedition located the wreck of the Scharnhorst on the floor of the Barents Sea. She lay at a depth of 290 meters, approximately 950 feet, roughly 72 nautical miles northeast of the North Cape. The wreck was upside down, her keel pointing toward the surface, her superstructure buried in the mud of the seabed. The survey team used sonar and remote-operated vehicles to map the wreck, and what they found confirmed the devastating effectiveness of the Duke of York's radar-directed gunnery. The hull showed at least 11 penetrations from 14-inch shells, concentrated in a remarkably tight pattern, amidships exactly where the armor belt protected the engine rooms and magazines. The grouping was extraordinary. In the darkness, in a blizzard at ranges of 7 to 12 miles against a moving target, the Duke of York's gunners had placed their shells with the precision of a peacetime firing range. But the detail that struck the expedition team most deeply was not the damage. It was the personal artifacts that littered the seabed around the wreck. Boots, mess tins, a crushed pocket watch, its hands frozen at 7:42 p.m., 3 minutes before the final explosion. And scattered among the debris, barely visible in the lights of the RO5 cameras, were dozens of small rectangular objects that the team initially could not identify. When the images were enhanced, they turned out to be photographs. Personal photographs carried by the crew in their pockets and lockers, now scattered across the ocean floor. Photographs of wives, children, parents, girlfriends. The faces of the people who 1,932 German sailors would never come home to. Admiral Fraser had understood this cost. That is why, on the night of the battle, standing amid celebration, he had spoken not of victory, but of gallantry. He had recognized that the men inside the Scharnhorst were not abstractions or statistics. They were sailors, just like his own crew, doing their duty in impossible conditions. The only difference was that one side could see in the dark and the other could not. From a radio repair shop in Glasgow to the bottom of the Barents Sea, from a flickering green blip on a cathode ray tube to the destruction of the last great German surface raider. William Crawford never received a medal, never gave an interview, never wrote a memoir. He fixed televisions until he retired and died quietly in the city where he was born. But on one frozen night in December 1943, his hands guided 1,590-pound shells through 17 miles of Arctic darkness and changed naval warfare forever. The Scharnhorst's sinking secured the Arctic convoy route for the rest of the war, enabling the delivery of over 4 million tons of supplies to the Soviet Union, including 5,000 tanks and 7,000 aircraft that helped turn the tide on the Eastern Front. The technology proven that night protects the warships of over 40 nations today, and the principle that a 23-year-old technician demonstrated in a steel box below the waterline, that information defeats power, that precision defeats speed, that the electron defeats the eye, remains the single most important doctrine in modern military strategy. Next time you read about a missile defense system intercepting a target at Mach 3 in the middle of the night over the Pacific Ocean, remember that it started with a former radio repairman from Glasgow, a stubborn admiral who believed in data over tradition, and a freezing December night when the last German Titan sailed into a darkness full of men who could see. If you know another story like this, a forgotten innovation, or an unsung person who changed the course of a war, share it in the comments. History is full of William Crawford's ordinary people who did extraordinary things and then went home without anyone noticing. Subscribe and hit this notification bell, because this is just one of hundreds of stories from World War II where a single idea dismissed as crazy, impossible, or forbidden ended up saving thousands of lives and reshaping the world we live in. The next one might be even more unbelievable than this. Because the greatest weapon in any war has never been the biggest gun or the fastest ship. It has been the mind willing to imagine what everyone else said was impossible, and the courage to prove them wrong.